Modified monkeys? Is that what we are? Is that what we are? Or is it just a mask some scientists want us to wear?
The origin of life community has not been honest.
Materialists understand that materialism cannot explain the mind.
Who am I?
Rather than abandoning materialism, they abandon the mind.
Our planet has water and carbon, both necessary for life. So the Earth is exceedingly rare.
You get many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made.
We come the way. How to spin, we'll show you the way. How to hit.
There exists a code so complex and advanced that it defies the probability of chance.
When we see information in software and we trace that information back to its source,
The way. How to spin, we'll show you the way.
we always come to a mind that's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us, that information always arises from an intelligent source.
Everything, if Darwin is right, is mechanical and blind and purposeless at the bottom.
Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark.
The cosmos is all it is, or ever was, or ever will be. The cosmos is all it is,
Mechanical and blind and purposeless at the bottom.
The cosmos is all it is.
How do they know the cosmos is all there is? Isn't our reality more than just matter? Most people and cultures around the world have a profound belief that life extends beyond the physical. That compassion, ideas, joy, and sorrow aren't made of matter, but are as real to us as our arms and legs. If we believe this, are we anti-science? Or is it materialism that is anti-science? Let's see what Dr. Jay Richards, an expert on modern materialism, has to say.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Materialism is really a philosophy about reality. It's just the idea that matter or matter and natural laws are the fundamental reality. So really the only thing exists is blind matter in motion, and everything else is explained in terms of matter.
This is the view of reality we are constantly bombarded with in our culture.
And I have a materialist view of the world, and so that commits me to the view that when I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself.
Wait, what? No free will? So, if all of our choices are delusions, then how can we be responsible for our actions? That's nonsense. Our choices are real, and we are responsible for our actions. It's how we stay civilized. In fact, the most important part of being human is immaterial. Love isn't just real, it's the most valued aspect of humanity. Even more than science. It is our consciousness, our sense of self, that gives us the ability to love. But what do materialists say?
The self is an illusion. The sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.
For the materialist, things like your thought or your existence or your purposes, they're just epiphenomena or sort of froth.
So, to a materialist, our subjective thoughts are not real. But our thoughts and beliefs have real consequences.
The thing that we all know most directly and most certainly, that is the existence of ourselves, is ultimately incompatible with materialism. Well, my argument would be, look, any philosophical view that entails you don't exist is a view that you really ought not to entertain. Frustrating is that in the modern age, People often try to identify this philosophical idea of materialism with the practice of natural science itself. But there's no reason these two things would go together. Natural science is just a formal way to discover truths about nature.
So how does science discover the truth about nature?
Test ideas by experiment and observation. Build on those ideas that pass the test. Reject the ones that fail. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, and question everything. Question everything.
Well, who's doing that? Who's setting up these experiments? What is an experiment? What is an observation? What constitutes evidence? Oddly, the scientific materialist has to deny the existence of scientists.
The self is an illusion.
Well, what is not an illusion is the bigotry and intolerance of the scientific community.
I want to put on the table not why 85% of the National Academy rejects God. I want to know why 15% don't.
Any view that challenges materialism is punished. It's this materialist dogma that keeps many scientists behind a mask. But some scientists are willing to speak up about where the evidence leads.
I was brought up with materialist viewpoints all the way through high school and college and medical school. You get inundated with scientific viewpoints that have a materialist bias.
The cosmos is all that is, all that is.
And it's all just mechanical and blind and purposeless at the bottom.
The deeper I looked into the science, the more I realized what a catastrophe for science materialism and atheism really is.
Science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
Materialism is not science. It's simply a worldview that fails to explain or even consider the most profound, interesting, and beautiful aspects of human reality. Materialists are free to preach their religion, but they should stop pretending it's science. We want to follow the evidence, wherever it leads, and decide for ourselves.
But looking at this, Morgan, one would not immediately guess that all of the richness of mental life, of intelligence, of categorization, of language, of planning, of emotion, could arise from the structure of this 3 pounds of flesh.
Your robot's made out of meat, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today. Robots made out of meat.
Intelligence, language, motion, 3 pounds of flesh.
Robots and meat.
Are you and I really robots?
What you are, what I am, is 100 trillion little cellular robots. Robots.
That may sound scientific, but is it? I spoke with Dr. Michael Egnor, a human brain expert.
An eliminative materialism is an ideological viewpoint, a philosophical viewpoint, but it's not a scientific viewpoint. It is the viewpoint that there is no such thing as the mind. It's not that the mind is explainable by matter, it's just that the mind doesn't exist at all.
The one thing almost everyone accepts is that we actually exist. We're persons, not just a collection of body parts. We have a self, an inescapable I. I have a brain, but I am not a brain. I feel emotions, but I am not an emotion. I think thoughts, but I am not a thought. Who are you? Think about it. Who am I? Most people feel they're more than their physical bodies. What materialists don't tell you is this feeling is actually supported by science. Recent research has revealed fresh evidence for an immaterial mind, where thoughts actually change your brain. Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz treats people who suffer from obsessive-compulsive disorder. His treatments provide evidence that thoughts can change our physical brains.
By training people, literally training them to reinterpret the feelings that you need to check or that something is dirty, reinterpret it as a false message from your brain. People could, in fact, learn how to understand that this is not me, this is a false message from my brain, and when they did that, their OCD improved and their brain changed. That's the part where you really get the leverage to say, you're not just your brain, because choices you make can actually change how your brain works.
This research clearly supports mind over matter. Mind over matter. Further evidence for an immaterial mind comes from an operation known as a corpus callosotomy. In this operation, you literally cut the brain in half by severing the corpus callosum.
It's an operation that I've performed, and their brains were essentially cut in half. But they still seem to be a unitary person. They still seem to be fairly normal. And what that implies is that the human mind is not purely generated by the matter of the brain. Otherwise, cutting the brain in half would have profound effects on the human mind. It might make two people. Certainly, it would create a rather profound difference in a person's state of consciousness, and it doesn't.
A third piece of evidence for an immaterial mind comes from brain stimulation experiments that seem to show our intellect and identity are not found in our brain tissue. Some of the most famous of these experiments were conducted by brain surgeon Wilder Penfield.
He was a meticulous scientist. He repeatedly observed that there were aspects of the patient's mind that no matter what he did to the brain, he couldn't affect. He could elicit memories by stimulating a part of the brain. He could make a muscle move or make a patient have a sensation, but he couldn't change their consciousness. He couldn't change their intellect. He couldn't change their sense of self. That no matter what he did to the brain, remained the same.
A fourth piece of evidence for an immaterial mind comes from experiments about free will. Materialists try to convince us that free will does not exist.
I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion. Free will is an illusion.
But Dr. Benjamin Leibott's experiments show that humans do have free will. At least the free will to say no.
About perhaps half a second before you decide to do something, there's a spike in your brain that he called the readiness potential. It's almost like an unconscious motive.
Materialists have used this readiness potential to suggest that we are misled into thinking we have free will.
Free will is an illusion.
That our material brain just sort of makes the decision. And we kind of think that we decided. But we didn't.
Leibniz didn't agree with that. He asked the subjects to do something more. He said, when you decide to do something, then decide not to. When they did that, he found that there was a readiness potential for deciding to push the button. But there wasn't a readiness potential to decide not to push it. And he said, he didn't prove the existence of free will, but he proved the existence of free won't. And that's what he called it, free won't. That in a sense we have motives that are beyond our control. We can't stop the motives, but we can stop ourselves from doing it.
Materialist scientists mostly ignore this evidence because it doesn't support their worldview.
You are cellular robots.
Materialists are realists in a sense. They understand that materialism cannot explain the mind. Rather than abandoning materialism, they abandon the mind, which I think is a mistake.
Neuroscience shows that you are more than your brain. This liberating evidence frees us to think rationally about who we really are, body, soul, and mind. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
The DNA code itself is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Totally interchangeable.
DNA code itself
is the software of life.
So digital.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, you know, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a programmer? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule. If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really? If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, and our DNA code can produce new organisms? Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 This, 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 or this.
Everything we know about software shows that random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new. And that's the problem with the mutation selection mechanism as an explanation for new genetic information. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital. And there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right. And so as you begin to randomly change them, you inevitably fall into a non-functional abyss long before you ever generate anything fundamentally new.
So just how unlikely is it for random genetic changes to produce something new, even something as modest as a protein structure with a new function? One scientist performed experiments that enabled him to actually calculate the odds, and they aren't good. In fact, they're next to impossible. We caught up with a molecular biologist, Douglas Axe, in Seattle.
In our lab work, we've asked how rare or how common functional proteins are within the space of possibilities. Doing experiments and calculations, we found that they're exceedingly rare, like 1 in 10 to the 74th power rare. To get a feel for those odds, imagine that somebody hid one atom somewhere within the Milky Way galaxy, and you, blindfolded by chance, are supposed to pick one atom and hope that it's the right one. Those odds would be better than the odds for the protein.
Axe calculated the probability for all the chance mutations in all of the life forms on Earth for billions of years. And in all that time, he found they couldn't chance on even one new functional protein structure. Not one. 0. And keep in mind, it takes thousands of distinct proteins to build any kind of complex life, including humans. And many of these proteins are unique to each individual life form. So we go from improbable to basically impossible.
The bottom line is that the mutation selection mechanism simply lacks the creative power to generate the new information necessary to build new organisms in the history of life.
If the material processes of mutation and natural selection aren't capable of producing the biological information needed for life, then where did it come from?
Our uniform and repeated experience, as Darwin himself pointed out, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. So when we see information in a digital form in software or we see a paragraph in a book, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us, that information always arises from an intelligent source. So we can apply that knowledge to the question of historical biology, and when we see that information is the foundation of life, we can infer that the best explanation for the origin of that information is in fact also a mind, a conscious agent, not an undirected material process.
When presented with evidence that conflicts with neo-Darwinism, most scientists cling to a belief in the blind process of evolution, denying what science has discovered. That at the foundation of life, there exists a code so complex and advanced that it defies chance. They make no room for the possibility that we were created by an intelligence far more sophisticated than the most genius of programmers. Instead, they choose to limit their investigation to a strictly materialist worldview. When faced with this evidence, how will you respond?
If you were designing a universe for life, I suspect you might design it differently. There is no evidence of design or purpose to our universe.
I'm a speck, on a speck, orbiting a speck, among still other specks, in the middle of specklessness. I am not, I am insignificant, I suck.
No design, no purpose.
I'm a speck in the middle of specklessness. I am insignificant.
Are we really just insignificant specks in an accidental universe? Do we really just suck? Those are some dramatic claims, but not everyone thinks that way. In fact, some very distinguished scientists disagree. Freeman Dyson, a world-renowned physicist and mathematician, says, and I quote, "The more I examine the universe and study the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known that we were coming." So maybe it's not an accident that Earth is habitable. We caught up with physicist Bijan Nemati, who was a senior engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab for over 16 years.
What we've discovered in the last few decades is that the properties of the universe in general, and our planet in particular, are fine-tuned, not just for our survival, but actually for our thriving, our benefit.
So Earth is not just habitable, it's better than that. It's hospitable. It's like this. Imagine you're a space explorer and you land on a distant planet. There's no water, no oxygen, and it's 300 degrees below zero. You're screwed. But then off in the distance you see a structure, and the closer you get, the more it looks like a house. When you open the door, you find it's been filled with warm, breathable air. You take off your spacesuit and find a faucet with drinkable water, and a refrigerator stocked with healthy and delicious food. What's your first thought? The house and everything in it was the product of a mindless natural process? Or that it was designed to take care of you, to meet your needs, and that someone prepared it as a home for human beings, like you? Our planet, Earth, is that home.
Our planet is a terrestrial planet. It has water and carbon, both necessary for life. It has an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere in just the right proportion for life to thrive. We have plate tectonics to circulate minerals. We have a magnetosphere that protects us from harmful radiation. Our moon stabilizes our axial tilt, giving us a stable climate. And we have gas giant planets, particularly Jupiter, cleaning up the solar system from comets and asteroids that could harm us. And we are located in the habitable zone of a very stable, energetic star, which itself is located in the habitable zone of a metal-rich, mature galaxy. So the Earth is apparently exceedingly rare.
There is no design or purpose to our universe.
Still stuck on that? Even though the Earth meets exactly the conditions needed to sustain life? Well, what about our universe and the precise settings of its physical laws that keep things in order? What they call fine-tuning. Cosmological physicist Frank Tipler explains.
Fine-tuning in physics refers to the observed fact, that were we to modify the constants of nature just slightly, life would never appear in this universe.
Imagine you have a universe app where you can mess with the universal laws of physics from the beginning of time. Starting with gravity, too strong and the stars would be unstable and deadly to life. Too weak and the stars would struggle to create carbon and oxygen. Again, no life. We got Stephen Meyer, who holds a PhD from Cambridge, to break it down.
The force of gravity is not too strong, not too weak. The speed of light, not too fast, not too slow. The ratios of these fundamental forces are delicately balanced. It's the just right universe that makes life possible.
So it's got to be exact. But materialists say we just got lucky with gravity. Now, let's set our universe app to random and tap the button. What are the chances that the app will luck onto a gravity setting that just happens to allow life to emerge? Scientists have crunched the numbers, and the answer? Not good.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say 1 out of 1,000,000.
Actually, for gravity, it's worse. Worse than 1 chance in 1,000,000,000 times 1,000,000,000,000 times 1,000,000,000,000.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Yeah! Yeah! We all love rooting for long shots, but here's the thing. It's not just gravity. There are many other physical laws that also have to be just so for life to emerge in the universe. And some of them are even more fine-tuned, even more unlikely than gravity. Without fine-tuning, our universe would be a horror story even Stephen King couldn't imagine.
The very construction of the world and the fact that we seem to be the only blue-populated planet in the universe, it makes you have to believe that if we happened by accident, it would make winning the lottery look like flipping a coin. So I have a tendency to believe in intelligent design.
Nobel Prize-winning physicist Charles Townes seemed to agree by stating, and I quote, "Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way." But of course, materialist scientists claim they have a better answer.
There's an obvious and easy naturalistic explanation in the form of the cosmological multiverse.
The multiverse acknowledges that the conditions necessary to make life in this universe are incredibly improbable. But it posits the existence of multiple billions of other universes, and we just happen to be in that lucky universe.
Keep in mind that there's no evidence that these other universes actually exist.
There are no experimentally tested laws of physics telling us that these other universes exist. No evidence for leprechauns, no evidence for unicorns, no evidence for the existence of other universes with different values of these fundamental constants.
And there's still another problem with the multiverse explanation.
The new mechanisms that have been proposed as possible ways of generating new universes themselves require fine-tuning. So in order to explain the fine-tuning, you have to posit prior universe-generating mechanisms that themselves require fine-tuning.
And so, in the end, you're left right where you started.
The many aspects of nature that have been fine-tuned for life are overwhelming. All of this evidence shows you are not insignificant. You are not an accident. And you don't suck. Someone had you in mind. Someone had us all in mind.
The life we have on Earth must have spontaneously generated itself.
Scientists have reason to think that the first living cells on Earth came about through a natural process called chemical evolution. First living cell chemical evolution.
Spontaneously generated itself.
Did life really spontaneously generate itself from chemicals? Has science shown this? We tracked down James Tour, one of the world's leading experts in synthetic organic chemistry, to find out.
All of these little pictures of molecules coming together to form the first cell are fallacious, are ridiculous. the origin of life community has not been honest. They will write in their very papers, they will see some small phenomena and extrapolate what this means in the context of origin of life. And then they will work with the press, and the press will extrapolate it all the more. And you get many, many people deceived, thinking that life has been all but made. All of this is a lie.
Scientist Craig Venter creates life for the first time in a laboratory.
We're here today to announce the first synthetic cell.
We haven't created life, nowhere close. What they did is they took a cell. They took the genome out of that cell. They manufactured a genome that's similar to it, and they put it in. That is akin to taking an engine out of a Ford and putting it into a Buick and then saying, look, I created automobiles. No, you just took one piece, and it's not even the engine, it's just the computer control box you took out of one car and you put it in another car. That's what it was like. But the design of the computer control box you got from other cells.
Other scientists say they've been able to create protocells in the lab that are the stepping stones to the first life.
I can mix some chemicals together in a test tube in my lab, and these chemicals will start to self-associate to form larger and larger structures. The protocell moves. As a metabolism, it could use energy and moves around.
Protocells are a bunch of nonsense. That is like a proto-turkey. I take 20 pounds of sliced turkey meat from a delicatessen. I throw that into a pot. I add some turkey broth. I warm that up, and I throw in some feathers, and I say, that's a proto-turkey. Yeah, there's no order to it, but you know, if you wait long enough, a turkey will come gobbling out. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? That's precisely what origin of life researchers have done when they make a protocell.
Wait a second. Haven't we been taught with hundreds of millions of years anything is possible?
Time is actually the enemy. You let these chemicals that have been made sit around. They show the degradation in a period of weeks. Weeks is the twinkling of an eye when it comes to prebiotic timescales. The chemicals decompose. So to think that the molecules could be made and sit there waiting for other molecules to come in, it doesn't happen. Organic chemistry doesn't work that way.
Well, if life didn't spontaneously generate on Earth, what about scientists who believe that life must have come here from outer space?
Whether you want to have it originate from Earth or from some other planet, you have to have the origin of life. You have to have the origin of that first cell. How does that happen? We have no idea.
So with all the advances in scientific research and the study of life, why can't we figure this out?
With all of origin of life research going on, the problem is becoming harder all the time, not easier. And the reason it's become harder is because we understand more about the complexity of a cell.
To help explain the complexity of living cells, we turn to molecular biologist Douglas Axe.
To get an idea of the complexity of a living cell, think of a factory with thousands of pieces of machinery all working together to do some coordinated task. A cell is actually far more complicated than that factory because factories don't maintain themselves. People have to maintain factories, and factories certainly don't make new factories. Whereas with a living cell, all the parts that wear out are automatically remanufactured within the cell. Not only that, the cell is manufacturing a new cell as well. Human-made factories don't even come close.
For a living cell to exist and perform such complex tasks, it takes some very detailed instructions, which are chemically encoded in our DNA.
If you have a string of nucleic acids like DNA or RNA has, you have to have a precise sequence because that translates to what proteins are needed to build the organism. That's called the information code.
But where did all that information, these detailed instructions, come from to build the first cell?
We don't have a tool to assess that within chemistry.
Laboratory chemistry may not, but Stephen Meyer is convinced origin science does have the tools.
Is there anything we know of that does have the causal power, the ability to generate new information, and therefore could explain the origin of the first cell? And I think there is, and that's the idea of intelligent design.
Intelligent design is defined as the theory that certain features of the natural world are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process.
Because what we know from our experience is that intelligent agents can produce information, and indeed do produce information, in a digital or typographic form, the form of information that we find in the DNA molecule, functional digital information. Whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we find it in a section of software code or a paragraph in a book or in a hieroglyphic inscription, we always find that a mind played a role in generating that information.
Don't be fooled by the hype. Materialists are further from explaining the origin of life than ever before, yet they still refuse to consider the only observable source known to create information code, an intelligent designing mind.
Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet.
The advent of the nuclear age may have accelerated the mutation process. Individuals with extraordinary abilities may already be among us.
Mutation is a critical ingredient in the recipe for evolution. Mutation generates variation, differences between individuals. Mutation generates variation.
Human evolution. Mutation. Human evolution.
What's fact and what's fiction here? Are mutations really the key to our evolution? Think about it. In real life, significant genetic mutations don't create superpowers. They create super challenges. Sometimes those mutations are even life-threatening. That's the reality. And yet we're told that random mutations with guidance from natural selection invented and genetically engineered every feature of every living organism.
Changes to life's instructions happen more or less at random.
Mutation generates variation.
Evolutionary biologists claim that random mutations accumulating over time ultimately produce life's features. If this is the case, zillions of chance mutations over the history of life led to the invention of flight and sight, immune systems and reproductive systems, even conscious beings with the capacity to love, reason, create art, and distinguish right from wrong. However, now, we no longer have to rely on speculative claims. Through experiments, we can actually observe mutations and see what they're doing to guide evolution. Biochemist Michael Behe has spent much of his life researching and studying mutations.
In the past 50 years or so, methods have been developed to track mutations, changes in DNA at the very molecular level. Now we can watch evolution in real time.
Since 1988, biologist Richard Lenski has been conducting one of the greatest evolutionary experiments ever done.
He started a culture of bacteria called E. coli growing in his lab. And since they reproduce so quickly, now they're up past 60,000 generations. And that's like 1.5 million years of human lifetimes.
So we are talking about numbers that are big enough to see some serious changes, if serious changes could come about.
In his work, he's seen a lot of beneficial mutations come along. But turns out that the great majority of the mutations were in pre-existing genes, and they either broke or degraded the genes. So the bacteria were evolving, improving more by devolution than by evolution.
It's difficult to understand how breaking a gene can be beneficial or helpful. Think of it this way.
Suppose you had a car, and the most important thing to your survival right now was the gas mileage. What could you do to improve the gas mileage of your car quickly? One thing you could do is rip out the back seat and throw it away. Back seats are helpful, but if your life depended on you getting better gas mileage right now, that would be a beneficial improvement. The problem with that, for Darwin's theory, is that ripping the back seat out of a car doesn't tell you how you make a back seat. Darwin's theory needs to show that organisms can improve by building things. And that's what has been missing in this terrific experiment.
This famous E. coli experiment shows that trillions of random mutations are not capable of building anything new. By the numbers, this E. coli experiment is giant, but it's dwarfed by the size of a natural experiment involving humans infected with malaria.
Every year, about 1 billion or so people contract malaria. So that's 1 billion times 1 trillion cells that are made each year on the planet.
In recent decades, scientists have exhaustively studied malaria. They've seen how it evolved resistance to several of the drugs used to treat it. But what is more interesting is what scientists haven't seen.
There were no new molecular machines, no new genes, and yet it had so many chances, evolutionary theory would have predicted that you'd get something really pretty impressive out of that, but it wasn't seen.
And it's not just malaria, it's not just E. coli. The pattern is widespread. For Behe, this raises a serious red flag for evolutionary theory.
The discovery that many beneficial mutations are actually destructive or degradatory mutations puts a huge monkey wrench into Darwinian theory. Not only can't Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection build complex systems, it has a strong tendency to degrade them.
This means beneficial mutations, what we have been taught are the building blocks of evolution, show no observable capacity to build or invent.
We see that overwhelmingly the good mutations come about by breaking old genes. So you're not making something new, you're throwing out something you already had. We see it in bacteria, we see it in mammals, we see it in birds, we see it everywhere that's been looked at so far.
This scientific evidence completely conflicts with evolutionary theory, and that is why the public never hears about it. Only a few brave scientists have been willing to speak out, like Lynn Margulis. I was taught over and over that the accumulation of random mutations led to evolutionary change, led to new species. I believed it until I looked for evidence. So if mutations aren't the building blocks of evolution, what can explain the invention of new things like the cell, or the eye, or flight? In birds, we find all kinds of amazing interdependent features that appear orchestrated for flight. We know from experience how difficult it is to get a flying machine and what it takes to build one. We observe things like purpose and function coming from intelligent sources, not from blind material processes. So when we see design, engineering, and artistry throughout nature, shouldn't we be looking for a designer, an engineer, an artist capable of fashioning what we see? We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.
How does something come out of nothing? How do we have a universe that comes out of nothing?
Astronomers believe there are 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. Scientists are still trying to figure out how all of this arose, seemingly out of nothing.
Well, it turns out if you apply quantum mechanics to gravity, then in fact space itself becomes dynamical, and universes, spaces themselves and time can pop into existence where there was none before.
So you can create whole universes where there was no universe before. And indeed, in that way, you might imagine creating a universe from literally nothing. Whole universes from literally nothing, out of existence.
Out of nothing.
Whole universes, nothing.
Wait, our universe popped into existence from literally nothing? There is no cause for all of this? So, straight up nothing. No matter, no creator, then poof, the universe? That's actually the story some atheist scientists are peddling right now. Sounds pretty desperate to me. Stephen Meyer, a philosopher of science and best-selling author, explains how atheists got backed into this corner.
It was generally assumed by most physicists prior to the 1920s and 30s that the universe was eternal and therefore self-existent, that it had always been here and really didn't require an explanation. There was one physicist said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of the universe at any finite time in the past.
But then, the idea of an eternal universe was challenged by a pair of surprising discoveries. First, it became clear that almost all the galaxies in the universe are moving away from us. Then it got weirder. Two guys figured out that generally the farther a galaxy is from us, the faster it's moving away. One was a Belgian physicist and Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. The second was American astronomer Edwin Hubble. Drawing on Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, they then realized that space itself is expanding. Physicist Brian Miller explains why.
Let me use an analogy. If you have a balloon and you imagine putting dots on that balloon to represent galaxies, and then that balloon inflates, what happens is all the dots move away from each other. And dots that are further apart will move away from each other even faster. And that's exactly the sort of evidence we see in our universe.
This discovery suggests that if you reverse time, like a movie running backward, then all the galaxies would draw back together to a single point, which led to a conclusion that some scientists didn't really want to face.
The universe has been expanding from a finite beginning point, where not only matter and energy, but time and space itself began.
Today, scientists call this first moment of the universe the Big Bang.
It all started with the Big Bang.
The Big Bang theory means the universe is not eternal after all. It has a beginning. Even more radical, the Big Bang implies that the cause of the universe must be something non-material.
The Big Bang shows that all of time, matter, space, and energy started at a single moment in the past. Therefore, whatever started it has to be outside of time and space.
You can't posit a materialistic explanation because there's no matter there before the beginning to do the causing.
Many scientists initially resisted the Big Bang, including Einstein, whose theory partly inspired the idea.
He really didn't want at that point in his career to think about the beginning of the universe because he didn't want to think about what would be necessary to explain the origin of the universe if we're talking about all of matter, all of energy, all of space and time.
Einstein eventually accepted the Big Bang theory, but others went on searching for an option that would fit the data without requiring an actual beginning. One that grabbed a lot of attention was the oscillating universe model.
The universe would be expanding outward, but then as the expansion slowed, the matter in the universe by gravitational force would cause the universe to recollapse. But once it recollapsed, then by some unknown mechanism, it would expand again. So you'd get a series of big crunches followed by big bounces. That theory ran into two big problems. The first was it was discovered that there was not enough matter in the universe to cause the universe to recollapse. And secondly, it was determined by thermodynamic analysis. The energy available to do work would diminish with each successive cycle. It would be kind of like a ball bouncing to the ground and finally it would damp out where there's no more bounces.
Who's gonna get it? They drop it. Oh, man.
So the oscillating universe model was a big fail. And actually, all the attempts to evade a true cosmic beginning ran into serious problems. The evidence for the Big Bang kept piling on until most scientists accepted it. Some scientists, however, found themselves facing serious doubts, not about science, but about atheism. World-renowned astronomer Robert Jastrow didn't believe in God, but he found it hard to get around what the Big Bang seemed to be telling him.
So there is a beginning, there is a point in time from which it all started. And that's a remarkable thing because it has a very strong theological flavor to it. And that intrigued me because I am an agnostic, and if there was a beginning, a moment of creation in the universe, then there was a creator.
Of course, a lot of scientists still resist going where the science seems to be leading. Take physicist Stephen Hawking. Before his death, he proposed a new argument against the need for a cosmic creator.
Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing.
Now, when I first read that, I was staggered because it's self-contradictory to start with. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. And then to say the universe can create itself, that's logical nonsense. If I say that X creates Y, roughly speaking, I'm saying if you've got X, you may in the end get Y. But if I say X creates X, then that simply proves to me that nonsense remains nonsense even if high-powered scientists say it.
Well, what about physicist Lawrence Krauss and his something from nothing idea?
Imagine creating a universe from literally nothing.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Because how they get a universe from nothing is by redefining nothing.
Krauss's nothing is actually something, a set of laws and mathematical equations. That's the first problem. Meyer explains the second problem.
Krauss's nothing involves the equations of quantum physics. And equations are mathematical entities. And mathematical entities are abstract concepts, always exist in minds. So his nothing seems to imply the need for a pre-existing mind.
A pre-existing mind. Now, what does that sound like?
The Big Bang provides very, very strong evidence pointing to God. Because it shows that everything started, all matter, time, space, and energy, at some point in the past, that means that something had to start it. And that something had to be immaterial, timeless, infinitely powerful, and even personal, because only a personal being can choose to act with purpose.
But some people will embrace almost any absurdity to avoid the possibility of God.
You say there are 3 different types of nothing.
That's right.
What are the 3? I didn't know there was such a variety. A sampler platter. You haven't been rubbing any of that baby shampoo on your head, have you? With the THC in it?
Well,
no?
I'm no
You're
comment.
clean?
No comment.
You're clean?
Yeah.
Leave me a hair sample.
3 kinds of nothing or 3 kinds of nonsense. If people can convince you that our entire existence comes from nothing, then it's just a short step to believe as a product of nothing, you are nothing. That all the things you see, touch, taste, smell, think, and feel mean nothing because they came from nothing, were caused by nothing, and serve nothing. But if you and the universe were created by someone, a grand creative genius, the maker of matter, energy, space, and time, then you were made for a reason. Your existence means something. You are here for a purpose. For those willing to open their eyes, that's the amazing reality science is revealing.
I saw that David Attenborough documentary on chimps where they were eating those colobus monkeys and ripping them apart. I go, oh, this is why people are so crazy. We came from that thing.
Yeah, exactly.
The search for the origins of humanity is a story of bones. It is the story of our progress from ape to man.
The time has come to take seriously the fact that we humans are modified monkeys.
Came from that thing.
From ape to man.
Fact, modified monkeys.
Modified monkeys? Is that what we are? Or is it just a mask some scientists want us to wear? Materialists seem intent on proving we evolved from ape-like ancestors. But is this really objective science? Let's take a look at the evidence. Dr. Casey Luskin, co-author of Science and Human Origins, shares his insight.
The fossil evidence for human evolution is extremely weak. I would say that the case for human evolution is driven more by an undying belief in materialist ideology than it is actual hard evidence.
Even world-renowned evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould admitted how shaky the fossil evidence for human evolution is. Most hominid fossils, even though they serve as a basis for endless speculation and elaborate storytelling, are fragments of jaws and scraps of skulls. Biologist Jonathan Wells has 2 PhDs from UC Berkeley and Yale. He takes it a step further.
The fossil evidence does not establish that humans evolved from apes. That's really a story to which the fossils have been added as illustrations.
The illustrations and drawings of these missing links are often highly speculative.
National Geographic many years ago had a page of drawings done by artists from the same set of bones. One looked like a gorilla, another looked like a modern human, another looked like a werewolf, all from the same set of bones. So the drawings are mostly imaginative, not evidence.
It's a shame that most people take these drawings and the stories they tell as fact, even when they contradict the actual evidence. Take the drawings of Homo erectus, which often appear as intellectually inferior and far from human. But the fossil evidence paints a different picture.
Below the neck, Homo erectus is almost identical to modern humans, and even its brain size is within the range of modern human beings. Homo erectus also used stone tools, they harnessed fire, and in fact, there's even some paleoanthropologists who believe that Homo erectus was capable of building boats.
Homo erectus appears to have been a lot more intelligent than what scientists originally assumed, and what the public is often being told. Same thing goes for Neanderthals.
Quite a few paleoanthropologists think that Neanderthals buried their dead, that they have been discovered with signs of high intelligence, including art and culture. So although many artist impressions will depict Neanderthals as very primitive, if a Neanderthal were to walk in the door right now, you would not be able to distinguish them most likely from a modern human being.
As if the drawings weren't enough, some evolutionists actually try to portray the ape-like fossils as more like human, just to fit the narrative of a missing link.
A classic example is Lucy. Many people will be surprised to learn that just a couple years ago, it was discovered that one of Lucy's bones in the fossil we call Lucy actually belonged to an ape. And it's very difficult to say if the entire collection of bones that we assign to Lucy actually belong to a single individual Lucy or even a single species.
But it goes even deeper than that, to the point of depicting Lucy with human feet.
They did not even find feet associated with Lucy's skeleton. She's almost always depicted as an upright walking ape-like species. Well, that kind of an interpretation is strongly disputed by the evidence. In fact, an article in the journal Nature studied the hand bones of Lucy and found that she had the knuckles of a knuckle walker.
This PBS documentary shows anthropologist Owen Lovejoy manipulating the fossils to make Lucy walk upright.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
And so in Lucy's pelvis had to be reconstructed using quite a bit of evolutionary interpretation and imagination.
Leslie Aiello is an evolutionist, about as mainstream as you can get. And she put it very bluntly. Lucy and her fellow Australopithecines are like apes, and the Homo group are like humans. What's true of Lucy is true of other fossils. Another example is Artie, hailed as another crucial ape-to-man link, but the reality is very different.
In fact, one report said that Artie's pelvis, which is of course a very important bone for determining whether Artie walked upright, was initially like an Irish stew. It was nearly crushed to smithereens and needed extensive digital reconstruction. Articles in the journal Science and the journal Nature found that Artie's skeleton was more like a modern ape than it was like a modern human, leading them to say that probably Artie was not even a human ancestor.
The evolutionists never tire of hyping the next big find.
In 2009, a fossil was discovered, nicknamed Ida, that supposedly was our ancestor. And it was called our Mona Lisa, the eighth wonder of the world. And it was a holy relic, until it turned out that it was actually a lemur, not related to human beings at all.
So, what's left of the ape-to-man fossil story after we set aside the fudged reconstructions, the imaginative storytelling, and the pro-evolution bias? Just a handful of inconclusive fossils and a massive gulf between ape and man.
Hominid fossils generally fall into one of two main categories, and that's human-like fossils and ape-like fossils, and there's a large, distinct gap between those two groups.
From ape to man.
It's time to lose the monkey bias. Without it, one can see what most people around the world already know. We humans are more than just another animal.
Chimpanzees don't talk, they don't do mathematics, they don't speculate, they don't cook, they don't dance, they don't do music. Any cursory examination of the great apes and human beings reveal profound differences, biomechanically, biochemically, but above all in its nature and soul.
Science does not need humans to share a common ancestor with monkeys. Materialism does.
So let's spend some time going through the facts and how evolution explains them all so well. First, fossils.
Now, fossils provide really good evidence for evolution.
And by studying these fossils, we can see how organisms have changed throughout the past, as we're able to see the small incremental changes that took place over millions of years.
The farther back we go, the more we see that everything alive has evolved from a single starting point.
The fact evolution.
We're able to see small incremental changes.
Fossils provide really good evidence for evolution.
Yeah, that's what I was taught in school too. But is the fossil record really good evidence for evolution? I asked Dr. Gunter Beckley, a fossil expert. He has discovered 180 new species in the fossil record and published over 160 scientific papers.
It is often believed that the fossil record is great support for Darwin's theory. Actually, this is not the case at all. The theory predicts slow changes, but the fossil record shows rapid changes. The theory predicts that new forms accumulate by addition of little small steps, but the fossil record shows they appear out of nothing suddenly.
Let's start with the most famous sudden appearance of life forms in geologic history, the Cambrian explosion. Geologist Casey Luskin explains.
Nearly all of the major living animal phyla appear abruptly in the Cambrian period in a geological eye blink, a 5 to 10 million year window. In the Cambrian explosion, we see many diverse body plans appear without any direct evolutionary precursors. In fact, one invertebrate zoology textbook says that the animal phyla appear fully formed, such that the fossil record is of no help to understanding how these species and these diverse body plans arose.
But is the Cambrian explosion the exception? Because we usually hear,
the fossil record clearly demonstrates that organisms don't suddenly appear.
The phenomenon of sudden appearances in the fossil record is not just an exceptional case, but actually is a pattern that is found everywhere. The origin of life, the origin of photosynthesis, the Avalon explosion, the Great Ordovician biodiversification event, the Siluro-Devonian terrestrial revolution, the Devonian nekton revolution, and the odontode revolution, the Carboniferous insect explosion, the Triassic explosions, the origin of flowering plants, the origin of butterflies, the Neo-Avian revolution of modern birds, the placental mammal radiation, the origin of the genus Homo, and finally the Upper Paleolithic human revolution.
Now that is a serious list of big jumps in the fossil record.
If you look at the technical literature, we can see references to a fish explosion, a bird explosion, a dinosaur explosion, a mammal explosion, and even the origin of our own genus Homo has been referred to as a Big Bang theory of human evolution, because we see throughout the fossil record different types of organisms appearing abruptly without this gradual change that Darwin's theory predicted.
In the middle of the Carboniferous period, we find the first flying insects. And the striking thing is there are no fossil precursors for them. There are no credible transitions. Just presto, this fully articulated marvels.
Just how bad is the fossil record for Darwin's theory? Anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz, who supports evolution, is blunt. Most major groups of organisms, he says, appear in the fossil record, full-blown and raring to go, in contradiction to Darwin's depiction of evolution. Some scientists say the transitions in the fossil record just look abrupt, and that we'll find the gradual transitions if we just keep on digging. Beckley thinks that explanation is no longer credible.
And here's why. Imagine you have a new hobby and you walk along the beach and you collect starfish and shells and snails. Every day you find something new, but over time, repetition sets in. And ultimately you reach a day where you only find over and over again what you already found. And then you know that you have sampled enough to know what is out there. Exactly this method is applied in paleontology to statistically test the completeness of the fossil record. It's called the collector's curve. In most groups of organisms, we know that the fossil record is sufficiently complete to be sure that the gaps that we see are not artifacts of undersampling or of an incomplete fossil record, but are actually data to be explained.
Some evolutionists basically admit that the many expected transitional fossils don't actually exist. They argue that the fossil record simply didn't have enough time to record the transitions. That was the view of two leading evolutionists who proposed a theory called punctuated equilibrium,
which said that basically species change so abruptly they don't have enough time to leave any transitional forms, and that was how they accounted for the lack of transitional forms in the fossil record.
But punctuated equilibrium has a problem. If major transitions really took place too quickly to be captured by the fossil record, there would be even less time available for genetic copying errors to accumulate into beneficial features, and evolutionary theory already faces a huge time crunch.
When we do mathematical calculations using standard textbook methods of population genetics, there simply is not enough time in the fossil record for random mutation and natural selection to produce the changes that we observe.
Let's look at whale evolution. Whales are said to have evolved from a land mammal in under 11 million years, but was that enough time to produce all the mutations required to create a whale? Richard Sternberg has 2 PhDs in biology and was a researcher at the Smithsonian. He has studied the evolution of whales in detail.
Imagine you were going to take your Volkswagen and have a submersible that could go down a few thousand feet. Well, how many engineering changes would you have to make to your vehicle to accomplish that? Well, it's similar, going from a 4-legged, fully terrestrial mammal to an organism that can complete its life cycle out at sea, give birth there, suckle the young, dive down 1,000 feet or so, hunt fishes, etc.
Just how many changes are we talking about here?
I would say from 10,000 to 20,000, maybe more traits had to change.
Could unguided evolution engineer that many changes in the time allowed? How about even a single new body part?
Let's say the origin of tail fluke. So if you imagine, say, that 2 genes are involved, according to some estimates, that would take about 43 million years for those 2 changes. There simply is not enough time.
In this case, we can prove mathematically that it is impossible that Darwinian evolution was the mechanism by which these supposed whale transitional forms evolved in this series.
In other words, Darwinian evolution can't even engineer a tail fluke in the time allowed, never mind the tens of thousands of changes needed to convert the land mammal into a fully operational whale. So if Darwinian mechanisms can't get it done in the time available, what can? Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
Whenever you see new forms of life arising, you also have to have new information. It's very much like in our computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you have to provide information in the form of software. And something very similar is true in life. If you want to build a new form of animal life, you have to have new organs and tissues. But new organs and tissues require new genetic information and other forms of information.
And this information has to come from somewhere. We know it where it does come from. If it is software programmers, if it is architects, if it is engineers, if it is artists, they are all capable of creating something complex and new because they are intelligent minds. And intelligent minds are the only causes we know in the whole known universe which are capable of creating this effect. This is not based on an argument from ignorance, but it's just based on a rational inference to the best explanation.
Scientists have been studying the fossil record for hundreds of years, and the evidence is now clear. If we just take off our materialist glasses and look, living things full of function, purpose, and design do not just appear by accident. A mind played a role in the creation of new forms of life, including you and me. We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We are the quiet majority, and we will be quiet no longer.